Okay, hi. So it's rather late, but we're going to talk about the nonfiction books I read in November. So obviously I was reading a lot of nonfiction for Nonfiction November. I was also reading a lot of books by Indigenous authors for Skoden Readathon, and we're just going to talk about those books. So hopefully I remember enough about them to provide you with useful information. We'll get started. I'll put out a video with like the fiction books that I read separately because I have a feeling it could be too long otherwise. So the first one I read was The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America by Sarah Deer. So I listened to this on audio. It was fairly academic, but still very easy to get into. So she kind of sets up this like thesis of like the treatment of women and the treatment of Indigenous women and like the high amount like the statistics around the assault and rape of Indigenous women, how Indigenous women's rapes are treated by society at large and by law as well. Is kind of situated as being a kind of an analogy for colonialism at large. She sets this up, but she doesn't deeply explore it. Like she kind of comes back to it from chapter to chapter. Overall, it was a really good read. A lot of really interesting facts. She breaks down like the actual law of like a U.S. law. She goes into some of the history of how this U.S. law developed. She talks about tribal law. Obviously, this is different depending on what tribe she's talking about, and she can't go into the details of every specific single tribe, but she talks about tribal law in like Dene. She talks about like the way that the U.S. like colonized system of law is. She talked about like the conservative ideals of the law, which I found like a really interesting concept. Basically, the fact that we all kind of take for granted that if a law, if a judge upholds something or kind of makes an opinion about something, it kind of becomes precedent, and that in itself is a conservative idea of how law can work, because like there was an example she showed of like a decision a judge made that it was like totally like just embracing like racist ideals from long ago, but it still upholds things in the court of law. She talked about like how like rape is classified by federal law on Indigenous lands, and there's some like federal U.S. federal like laws and like that have gone through and stuff. So it is very like it talks a lot about the law. It's very there's a lot of technical information in it. There's a lot of historical information in it. She also talks about the kind of some tribal law and like how it is kind of comparing it to the federal U.S. law, and trying to find some sort of like happy medium between the two that like looks at the survivors of rape and what their needs are, and not just like acclimating the rapist, essentially. The other thing I wanted to mention is that it's very heteronormative. So the assumption that kind of exists at the basis of the text is that most people who get raped are women being raped by men, which statistically speaking is the case. And she barely touches on like rape of other genders and like two-spirit and trans folks and like rape of men. But I wish that was just integrated into the text a little bit more. This also was not against the idea of policing individuals and like putting them into prisons or making them pay in some respect for their crimes, which I'll get into a little bit in one of my other reviews. Okay, the next one I read for Nonfiction November was the Undocumented Americans. So this is written from the perspective of the actual author. It's kind of kind of like twisted by Emma Dabiri, where it's like part memoir, part like something else. And so it's kind of part memoir. She is undocumented. She is talking about like being an undocumented American and like growing up. She talks a lot about like the kind of how she came to the United States, like her family dynamics, but then she like talks about like specific people that she has met kind of in her work and just like met undocumented people and their stories and just like really like humanizes the plethora of experiences that undocumented people go through, people being deported, people coming in, like racism that they face, like the rights that people don't have. She has like, there's like for me, a pretty impactful chapter about 9/11 and the undocumented immigrants that cleaned that space and like fixed, like were the people who came in and like cleaned everything up afterwards, and like the lack of healthcare and really the lack of recognition that those people face. And then she kind of talks at the beginning about how like people's like names and everything, like she changed people's identities. Obviously, like that happens a lot in memoirs, but in the case of people being undocumented, you need to protect people because they can be deported at any time. So there is this really interesting mix of her talking about like her, like the truths, but then like also like her imaginings of people. Like she kind of would start to, like sometimes it kind of, there are pieces that felt like it like forayed into like a fiction in her own head. Overall, I found it really powerful. I think that it's important to read stories that are or nonfiction that's academic on a subject, memoir, but also just like the experiences of individual people, the humanization of everyone. So I thought this was a really good read, and I would recommend it. Okay, the next one I read are Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Y. Davis. Is it Y? Yeah. This was written in 2003, so I think 2003. It was published somewhere around the Bush administration, so it was just really interesting to see how things, as much as things change, they stay the same. It was interesting to read after the beginning and end of Rape because there's, like that book, that academic book, the focus was much more on the victims of a crime, when this book is more of just like, are prisons like the best path forward? A little bit, some of it was out of date. Obviously, you're not going to be getting like new facts from it of like what the prison system is like, looks like now, but it was more just like posing the question. And I don't know, I liked it, but it didn't give me like a lot to like bite into in terms of like the content. It was more just like interesting to kind of see that this was obviously an influential, like philosophical or book that people have utilized and kind of moved forward with. I have a lot of thoughts about the prison system and the judicial system, and she gives a lot about the historical context of prisons and like kind of why they were made and when they were the first ones were, and so that part was definitely interesting because I hadn't read about those before, and she's specifically talking about the prison system in the U.S. and what prisons were used for. But I do kind of, I sometimes I feel like this concept is very much simplified. I don't think it's, just a matter of like, should you have prisons or should you not have prisons? Because like the amount of crimes that we put people into prison for are like very large and expansive. So I don't know if I would really recommend this unless you're looking for like the philosophical understanding and maybe a little bit of a historical understanding of the prison system, but I think that you could get some of that from other texts. Okay, next one I read is Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance by Nick Estes. I listened to this on audio. I think I listened to all of the ones I've mentioned on audio. This was really good. So this starts you off with something that's like a more modern occurrence that most people know. So like the DAPL pipeline in North Dakota and like the resistance that happened there. It made major news in 2014 or 2016. And it was focused at the time on the indigenous resistance in the Dakotas around this pipeline. And then the author uses that as like the modern example of indigenous resistance and kind of keeps going back in time and providing other examples of like indigenous resistance to colonialism and settlers through time, and just giving different examples. And like there is most of the examples I think were around the same tribe in South Dakota, if I'm remembering correctly. There were other examples as well. I found it really fascinating. It explored a large array of topics, mainly like land. It touched on some topics without going deep into them, which wasn't really the point of the book, to dive deep into everything. It talks about like the damming of rivers. Impacts to the environment were thought of more in terms of like the white towns as opposed to how it would impact indigenous town or indigenous land. Like there's examples of people having to relocate multiple times because dams like just flooded their areas. They flooded allotments. Talked very briefly about allotments. It talked about like the stealing of different lands, specifically the Black Hills, and overall it was just like a really interesting read. For me, it's hard to read like a straight history book where you're just getting a lot of facts, so I really liked that they took the concept of indigenous resistance, connected it to something that is familiar in modern times for most Americans, and then use that same like trajectory to talk through time. They also talked about like indigenous resistance on a more global level. Overall, I thought it was a really good read. I would definitely recommend this one. Okay, next one I read is A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. So Billy Ray Belcourt is a queer author. He is by trade a poet, and this is like an essay collection that he wrote that is memoir-like. He talks a lot about like his life growing up. He talks about his relationship to his grandmother and to his family members, to his brother, to his queer identity, to like discovering his identity, to interacting with his queer identity, to interacting with his race and like embracing himself. This has a very specific writing style. So I had a hard time reading this book. If it was any longer, there's a good chance I would have DNF'd it. It's pretty short. His writing is something you're gonna like, or it's something you're not gonna like. And I don't even know if it's a matter of like. It was like the sentence structure I had a really hard time like comprehending it and like having it flow. It was very hard for me to read and like not get lost in his writing. I actually ended up listening to a few interviews of him as I was reading this because I'm like, maybe this is how he talks, and if I hear his cadence, then I'll like get a better understanding. But it wasn't how he talked, it's how he writes, and like I almost felt that this would have been easier for me to consume if I did it on audio and I heard it in the cadence that he is like trying to write it in. Sometimes it worked for me, like some of the essays I was good with, but other ones I got completely lost in. Also, he uses a lot of really big words, so not only was I lost in like the writing, but then I'm like looking up words as I'm reading and I'm getting even more out of the experience. So like maybe he's just too smart for me, but it was a challenging reading experience, very purple prose. So if you're into that and you like memoirs, like maybe you'll like this, but I have a hard time recommending it just based on the cadence of the writing. Okay, I only read one more. So the last one I read was Beyond the Wand. The Magic and Mayhem of Growing Up a Wizard by Tom Felton. So this was Tom Felton played Draco Malfoy in the Harry Potter movies. This is kind of his memoir. It's him growing, it's like essays through time. They're chronological for the most part. He started acting a little bit before Harry Potter, and he was a little bit older when he was on the cast. So he kind of talks about his family. He talks about like some of the things that he did before Harry Potter. He talks about Harry Potter. He kind of has essays for like the main characters. Like he has one for Daniel Radcliffe, one for Emma Watson. Like, yes, he talks about being slapped by Emma Watson. And then he kind of talks about post Harry Potter and like some of like the mental health issues he faced when he moved to the United States, specifically California. It's obviously like written by an actor, like the writing isn't that great. And where with like Jeanette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, like you don't have to know who she is to really like I think appreciate the text and appreciate like what she's contributing. I wouldn't really recommend this book to anyone who isn't a fan of Harry Potter and just like wants to get some behind the scenes. It's kind of interesting because like I feel like it kind of like goes into that place that celebrity memoirs go to where he kind of like backs off of a lot of things and like doesn't want to bash anyone, and like sometimes that can feel like they're not really giving their full opinion. But then when it came to like his issues with alcohol later in life, he kind of dove right into them and brought you right into some of the things that were happening. And that felt like the most vulnerable part of the book. Yep, so that's all the nonfiction I read in the month of November. I really enjoyed reading those. I think I had a good reading month, but then I was so burnt out on like tragic stuff. I read a lot of dark things in November, so we've been reading more fluff in December. But anyway, that is all I have. So until next time, happy reading.